I'd like to draw your attention to a story actually out of The Guardian, forgive me, but there's a professor, apparently, Professor Tommy Curry, who left Louisiana and went to Scotland to be a professor there at the University of Edinburgh. Now, what's interesting is that I think this case sort of epitomizes some of the race-baiting politics that you see today, and he kind of has internalized these political mantras. And so I'd like to go through it with you and just show you really how disturbing this actually gets, because it's like the person can no longer see straight after a certain time because all they see is race, both in the mirror and elsewhere. Okay, so let's go through this article at The Guardian together. Okay, so here we are. The real issue is change. And he starts off as a Louisiana-born academic who helped lead the university's self-critical inquiry into its extensive links to transatlantic slavery. Be reminded that Scotland didn't have the sort of slavery that the United States had, right? Can we just bear that in mind before we go much further? And also the British Empire was instrumental in destroying slavery throughout much of the world. All right, but let's keep going. He says, I'm a first-generation person. I grew up in poverty, grew up at the end of segregation. Why is that important to not be the first? Well, it's important because everyone has an in. And if there's nothing left after you're in, you just become a symbol for somebody else's story. No. I mean, he's the first black philosophy professor at the University of Edinburgh, and that's his claim to fame. So imagine this. You're a white male who's straight, and so you don't have any of the sort of favorite characteristics, and you become the professor of philosophy at Edinburgh University. Is there any reason to become that? Because according to the worldview of this individual, the answer would be no, which is kind of horrifying, because what it means is that he is solely identifying by what he is, i.e. a black man, and not at all with what actually he can offer, right? Not at all with what he can accomplish, what he can, think about, what he can reason, what he can share. None of that actually matters. None of it becomes defining anymore, because instead it's all about being black. It's all about being seen as being black, and that's it. I hope you can see just how really wrong that is in terms of how he self-identifies and how he sees the world. I think this is very normal amongst an academic class that has too much of an influence upon our society. Let's keep going. He says, this article says, his singular status in Edinburgh's philosophy department, which lists 12 tenured professors, also, he added, points to one of the most important findings of its investigation: the severe underrepresentation of black staff, the patchy recruitment of black and ethnically minoritized students, and continuing staff and student experiences of racism, which is provided with no evidence. And it says that the review found that less than 1% of the university's employees were black. We'll get to that in a second, a figure that has been static for some years. A different picture emerges with other ethnic groups. The number of Asians, a category which includes Japanese, Chinese, and South Asian people, reached 9% in 2022 to 23, up from 7% in 2018 through 2019. Okay, so let's pause there for a second. Exactly how many people you can have employed in the university, to some degree, is going to reflect the world around you, right? Literally the population, the surrounding population, is going to be limited by that. And then you're also going to have disparities in race according to what people are interested in. It's not the case that we should just take racial groups and say, hey, you have to work in this field because we have quotas to meet. That's the sort of candidly barbaric philosophy that these people are embracing, right? And what we actually see from the data that he gave, essentially the Decolonization Review gave, is that there is no, pro-white bias as is implied by the entire thing. In fact, the university is quite fine with non-whites being employed. What was it, 9% of various different types of Asian. And so it's simply the fact that the number of black employees is low but not nil. And I imagine that the population in Scotland of black individuals in Edinburgh is probably fairly low too. They may not be an exact match, the surrounding population, to the number of professors, because that's just not how human beings work. We all have different affinities. It's the whole thing of, well, how many women in your surrounding area work on garbage trucks? Do you see a disparity? You see the persecution? It's ridiculous, right? To assume that you would actually have that exact connection, that exact concordance. Of course you're not going to have that, because people are human beings instead of simple racial groups or people who should be judged by their group class like that. Okay, so let's keep going. And you see here, the university's undergraduates were 2% black. Okay. And this says, while there is a dominant white racial majority in the UK, and especially in Scotland, the basis of comparison must not presume that small numbers of non-white racial and ethnic minorities in Scotland offer an appropriate baseline for comparison. In other words, just to say this again plainly, he's saying that the area around the university apparently should not in any way reflect the university's employees at all, which is to say that if there's really low percentage of, for example, black individuals, that shouldn't affect the fact that you have fewer to choose from in terms of employment. Or at least that's what he said. But then you see that according to census data, the surrounding population is 2.1% black, which aligns with the population of students. Then you have a 1% black employees or professors. There actually isn't a problem, but he's hunting for one. And that's what seems to be so common. If you can only see through this lens of race, or specifically not just race, but racism, if that's all that you can see, then you no longer see the fairness that's inherent in giving people the positions that they're qualified for. You don't see that at all. You also can't just do the math and say, well, if only 2% of the population are black, then we're going to have fewer black professors than we are of the 98% of the population, for example. This isn't hard math. I'm not good at math. Candidly, I'm not. Not just because I'm female, but but seriously, this is not difficult to comprehend unless you've been through so much. I'm hesitant to call it education. If you've been through so much schooling that is race-based and race-baiting, that you can no longer see straight. And that's really what we're seeing here. And if we scroll down, he says, how does a free society that's free of racism produce the same kind of outcomes that a segregated racist society produced in the United States? I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious, but it's a per capita thing. Literally, there are just fewer black people in Scotland than there are in the United States. So to say that the current demographics of the University of Edinburgh is reflective of the segregation that didn't occur there, it is not just like ridiculous, it's actually kind of monstrous, because it assumes some kind of right to a specific racial demographic disparity on the basis of what? I mean, because that's what he's saying, that we ought to have the same ratios, I guess you could say, of racial groups that you would have in other areas of the world that have entirely different ratios in their population. And that's just simply not going to take place if you have a fair system. Right? If you have anything that's remotely fair, then that just wouldn't be the case. And then we scroll down further, and it says, the newly published Slavery and Decolonization Review urges Edinburgh to fund a new centre for the study of racisms, weird plural, colonialism and anti-black violence. Frith points to the review team's decision to recruit paid black and minority ethnic scholars and activists who specialize in colonialism, reparations policy, and the repatriation of remains. Okay, so here's the thing. I hate the fact this is sort of like an American export from Louisiana to Scotland, and he's taken with him some of the worst of American academic understandings. But this idea that you would want to not have more black and whatever other racial group professors in different fields that can actually accomplish something. That isn't the goal. So often, that isn't the goal. The goal is to create these entire departments through which you can berate other groups for not being your own. Because basically that's what you see in all of these different, race-based departments, especially a DEI department, right, is a sort of critique of the past and an attempt to undo all of the good of the present by disparaging anyone that came before. And in so doing, this is a very strong leftist ideological motion, in so doing, they attempt to sort of erase the fundamental foundations that have built our societies, whether that's America or over there in Britain as well. You see the very same thing. It's let's remove the heroes of the past. Let's topple the statues. Let's have, I don't know, I think the communists have called it a year zero moment, right? This is the same thing, and they do it using this sort of DEI. That's one of the ways that they do it, is with this DEI style, these foundations, these organizations, so that they can attack any suggestion that there were great people, or even that we had a great civilization, which isn't to say that you had a perfect one. You should never, I think, compare a civilization or a time to a utopia, because that's just kind of foolhardy, because you're comparing it to that which cannot be. So let's not do that. But we can at least say that there were some things that were good, that having a civilization to work as a vehicle of faith was absolutely good. And increasingly, people are unwilling to say that, or instead trying to sort of create their own civilization from scratch, built upon guilt and shame of large collective groups, and that, candidly, is evil. And then at the very end, it says, so when we're looking at why it's important, it's because if the University of Edinburgh served as the pinnacle of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century for this work, why can't it serve as the same center to undo it in the 21st century? And I think that kind of summarizes the entire point, which is apparently all about that, right? All about tearing down and destroying, and not really about building anything up. I mean, again, he wanted to be the first. Why? So that he could be seen and representative solely of his race and not actually his accomplishments. And that's something that we all ought to condemn. It ought to be condemned by society as a whole, but increasingly we just, I don't know, people seem like they've been shamed into silence. And I think that we need to start being that way. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, check out my other work, whether the on-screen videos, which should be over here somewhere, my writings, or even the book. There are options for you. Stick around.